We are going to be talking about halacha, about Jewish law to a certain extent, because we're going to be talking about the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, of learning and teaching Torah. And we're going to talk about one of the very earliest that we know of, woman who took on that mitzvah on her own, um, even though there clearly was pushback against it based on interpretations of law and other issues. So we'll be seeing some of that together. As we said, some emotional ups and downs. I think for me, it's emotional up and down because, or highs and lows, let's say that way, because we're going to be talking about how some barriers that had to be overcome, that perhaps we as moderns would be sad that those barriers exist altogether. Overcoming barriers, and then resistance to overcoming barriers, and then understanding a little bit about some of those ideas today. Hopefully that will be the emotional high to leave on. Okay, so there's our whole intro. As you know, everything that I do, really, we make sure to put it in historical context as well. So I'm going to spend the first part of today catching us up a little bit about the history of a time period that we have not yet discussed, namely the beginnings of Rabbinic Judaism. Because if we're talking about a woman who was not the first rabbi, but really was the first woman that we know of who was immersed in rabbinic texts, we need to understand a little bit what we mean by that terminology. And so I thought it would be a good time for us to go over some of that history together to give us a fuller understanding of this woman named Beruriah, who we're going to be focusing on once we understand how and why she's so important based on the history. All right, so over to the screen share. Oh, I think also we forgot to say questions happen midway and at the end. And of course, you're welcome to write them in the chat, or there'll be a chance for you to actually speak them out loud if you want to at those two times. Okay, here we go. I'm going to rearrange so you can see everything as well as possible. Terrific. So, Beruriah, ancient Talmud scholar. Now, I thought it was important for us to understand the word Talmud and the time period of the Talmud. So, I've shown you timelines in the past of all of Jewish history, but I thought it was important for us to focus on these specific eras that we've been talking about to understand where we are talking, what we're talking about today. So in order to do that, I put together a chart for us. So the chart period, as you see here, has 3 columns: time period, the years we're talking about, and the important pieces of literature from that time period, because after all, they don't call us the people of the book for nothing. Our eras are very often characterized by the literature that we produce, and it becomes so important in that time period. So we have the biblical period, and of course, we've talked about a lot of biblical women together. I said, I don't know when exactly that starts because it depends on your view, whether you're going religious or historical or some other view in between. So it's super old, but it ends around the year 500 BCE, maybe actually a little bit later than that. And I would say the main book or set of books really from that time period is the Tanakh, right? The Torah and the books of the prophets and the books of the writings. After that, after the closing of the biblical era, we have the Second Temple era, where we have Second Temple Judaism. This is when the temple was rebuilt after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, after the Babylonian exile. If you don't know what any of those things are, don't worry, we could have a whole other class on that. But at around the year 517 BCE, Jews started returning to Israel from exile and started rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, which was a long process. But then the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, was in existence there, the second temple, for a few hundred years until it was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 CE. During that time period, we don't have any traditional books produced, but we have lots and lots of oral tradition that some of it was recorded in later periods, which we'll get to in a minute. We do have other books that were produced that turned out to be the kind of non-normative of Judaism, but that are preserved for us by historians or by archaeology, not by the rabbis, who, as we will see, become kind of like the main gatekeepers as to what is Judaism and what is not. All of that only started around the end of the Second Temple period. Before that, there was a little bit more freedom of interpretation, and there was Hellenistic or Greek Jewish literature produced at that time period. We actually studied one of those books together, namely the story of the book of Judith, and other things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which some of you know from trips to Israel and whatever else, were produced during that time. Then everything changed about not only Jewish literature, but Judaism, with the destruction of the temple. I made it in bold red here, that happened in the year 70 CE. And that's really the shift from Bible and temple Judaism to what we call Rabbinic Judaism. It's really the Judaism that we observe today. Now, there was a classical time period of classical Rabbinic Judaism when this was all kind of coming together, and when the major pieces of literature were produced, original pieces of literature of Rabbinic Judaism, namely words that I'm sure you've heard before: Midrash, Mishnah, Talmud, and Gemara. Now, we're going to understand a little bit more actually about one of those words in particular, Talmud, because that's the one that we're focusing on today. But I wanted you to see within this scheme of history and types of Judaism where the Talmud falls in here. Okay. Now, next, let's see a little bit more about that. As I said, with the destruction of the temple, there's a major, major shift in Judaism, namely from biblical to rabbinic Judaism. And really what was before, here on the left side of your screen, where it says temple and sacrifices, that was like the main deal of Judaism in the biblical era and post-biblical era. But once the temple is destroyed, you could either give up and say, well, there's no more Judaism anymore, or you could reinvent based on other evolutions that were happening in Judaism at the time, and say that the temple is now being shifted. The focus that used to be in the temple is being shifted, to the synagogue and to the house of study, or the Beit Midrash, or the yeshiva, however you want to call it. And the concept of sacrifices, which was the main ways of worshiping God and having a relationship with God in the temple, changes to be a focus on prayer, but not only prayer, Torah study. Okay, so I think that the idea of synagogue and prayer as being the focus of Judaism and Jewish ritual life is something that all of you know. But the concept of the centrality of the house of study and Torah study as being absolutely essential to Rabbinic Judaism is something that I really want us to focus on here. Because otherwise, nothing else that we're going to talk about makes a tremendous amount of sense. The idea is that in order to be in and to have power and to have leadership and to have influence in ancient Rabbinic Judaism, and many would argue traditional Judaism until today, you have to be part of this, the house of study, the Beit Midrash or the yeshiva, and your life has to be involved completely or mostly in the concept of Torah study. And I think that many of you are starting to understand now that we see that focus, that these were not avenues that were necessarily open to women, okay, which is our focus, obviously. So we're going to get back to the concept of women for a minute. I first want to just talk about the word Talmud for a minute. So everyone's heard the word Talmud. And as a matter of fact, I think throughout even today's talk, I'm going to be maybe a little bit sloppy, but a little bit kind of legitimate in terms of how people speak about these topics. Sometimes when I say Torah study in this context, what I really mean is the study of Talmud. Because the Torah, you guys all know that, right? That's the stuff in the scroll that you hold up in shul. But everyone knows that that's not all of Judaism. You need you need to understand it and interpret it and have oral traditions combined with all of it and analyze it in order to try to figure out a workable, livable Judaism that one practices, not rather than just one reads about, especially in a world without temple sacrifices. And all of that information starts to be shared in the Talmud. And so the idea, and the Talmud's not an easy thing. It's written in Aramaic. It's written in a very difficult style. It's huge, okay? It is made up of 63 tractates, or Masechtot in Hebrew, which is a fancy way really of saying volumes. So it's an entire library. It's not one book, it's a library of books. It spans discussions and traditions of 600 years. And there are different people that have tried to figure out exactly how many ideas are in there. But just to give you a sense, there are probably approximately 2,000 rabbis quoted in this library of texts that we call the Talmud. Of all of that becomes the central document of study as part of the house of study, which is one of the central areas of Judaism, aside from the synagogue. In all of that, only one woman is named as accomplished in the study of Talmudic law that would come on par to one of those 2,000 rabbis mentioned. Now, take a step back. By the way, that woman's Beruriah. We'll get to her in a minute. But why no women? Okay, I don't have an exact answer, but I have some theories for you. First of all, we have the famous word beloved by our good friend, everyone knows him, Tavia the Milkman. Tradition, like they say in Fiddler on the Roof. People don't like to see change very much. And the leadership, as far as we know it, ritual leadership, with the exception perhaps of a few of the prophetesses who we discussed, leadership and the centrality of kind of worship and control of the Torah, Talmud, and relationship with God has been male-centered in Judaism, okay, even in ancient times. A lot of that has to do with our number two here, the concept of patriarchy, right? From a sociology perspective, this isn't only true for Jews. The idea of power has very often been centralized in male hands. And finally, though, we do have another piece of the puzzle here, namely halacha, or rabbinic law. As it turns out, the study of Torah, as we see it implicated through the study of Talmud, is not just something that you want to do. It is something that one must do. In fact, it is a commandment or a mitzvah. Once we start talking about commandments and mitzvot, we all know that in traditional Judaism, it does not come down as equal necessarily between men and women. Guys, someone needs to just mute their volume, I think. That I can hear some noise in the background. Someone's phone ringing. Anna, can you make sure people are muted, please? Okay, so let's talk more about this mitzvah of Torah study. There isn't a passage in the Torah that says, thou shalt read the Torah, or thou shalt study the Torah, but it's rather something that has kind of been analyzed by the rabbis and probably passed down through oral tradition, that it is based on a particular verse in the Bible. Let's understand this a little bit better. I have here an explanation. The positive commandment, so positive in this case means like thou shalt, as opposed to thou shalt not. Like thou shalt not kill is a negative commandment. You have something not to do. But a positive commandment, like thou shalt keep Shabbat, to keep it holy, that would be a positive commandment. So too here, the study of Torah is a positive commandment. Thou shalt study the Torah. So what does that mean? The positive commandment is actually numbered off as number 419 of the 613 traditional understanding of the list of the numbers of commandments. So the positive commandment to study the wisdom of the Torah and to teach it, meaning to say how we should perform the commandments, guard ourselves from that which God prevented us, and also to know the laws of the Torah according to their true intention. Those are all kinds of rationales as to why we should learn and study Torah. But really, we don't need the rationales. We can go to a quote from the Torah itself, where it says in Deuteronomy, thou shalt teach them to your two sons, not daughters, but sons. And because of that, the mitzvah of Torah study is traditionally believed to be incumbent upon males only and not females. I just also want to point out what I highlighted here in the red. When I say the mitzvah of Torah study, it's not just study, it's study and teaching it. So it's the active and the passive. It's to be the student and the teacher. All of that, even informal teaching or parent to a child teaching, all of that is wrapped up within the same mitzvah. So how do we know? Actually, this actually is a quote from the Talmud, where it's kind of, in case you couldn't figure out that it's only to your sons and not to your daughters that you have to teach, and therefore they have to learn. It is spelled out in another place in the Talmud, where it says, and from where is it derived that others are not commanded to teach a woman? And remember, teaching and learning in this case are intricately combined. As the verse states, and you shall teach them to your sons, as the same verse we said before, which emphasizes your sons and not your daughters. Okay, yes, I emphasized it by putting it in bold with that underline, but the emphasis is put in the Talmud itself. So you should know that sons here means sons only and not daughters. And it's not necessarily a given, right? Because in Hebrew, I think we've talked about before, being a gendered language, much like French and other languages, there's no such thing as a gender neutral term for children. So the standard sons sometimes means sons and daughters, and sometimes means sons only. In this case, it means, from a traditional understanding, going all the way back to the Talmud, if not before, it means sons only and not daughters. So we have this concept of Torah study, which is now so central to Rabbinic Judaism, which is normative Judaism in the time after the destruction of the temple, that now it seems like it is not available to 50% of the population, at least, namely women. So there's a lot of discussion. We're not going to get into all of it, but I think it's interesting to think about. Does that mean that Torah study, Torah teaching and study, same thing, they're intertwined? Is it forbidden to women? Or is it just discouraged? Is it permitted? Or is it encouraged, right? There's no mitzvah to do it, but does that mean it's forbidden? Okay, so it's an interesting thing there to keep in the back of your mind. So I think for a lot of Jewish history, a lot of times it actually was considered forbidden by a lot of different Jewish thinkers and leaders. But others said, well, no, it's not, I mean, that it is forbidden. It's not that it's forbidden. It's just that it's not a mitzvah for them to do it. So maybe they could do it. They're permitted to do it. They don't have to. They're not legally enjoined to do so, but perhaps women should be allowed to do it. Now, once they're allowed, does that mean that something should be just, if they happen upon it themselves, or is it something that should be officially encouraged? And this is the kind of thing that became much more, these are the discussions that became much more central and important in Jewish history once we get to modern times, the late 1800s and into the 1900s, and of course in our era, in terms of with women's equality, being so prevalent in certain parts of the Western world, shouldn't we allow women to do these things as well? Not only allow, but even encourage. But really, before modern times, where women had not a central role in Judaism, they were not encouraged en masse to study Torah. However, there were always special, unique people, special and unique families, special and unique fathers who saw in their daughters something special, and in those cases, decided to personally encourage Torah study, not only to be part of the Jewish people, but I would argue like to be an important central figure in the Jewish people, because Torah study and the stamp of approval that being engaged in Torah study gives you was so, so very important for Jewish society, all Jewish society, until very, very recent times. And again, in some groups today, even in current times. All right, so remember when I started introducing you to this idea of the concept of Talmud and reminding you, depending on your background, I did mention that there is one woman who is named as accomplished in the study of Talmudic law, the entire Talmud, and that is Beruriah, the woman who we are meant to be focusing on today. Well, who was Beruriah? We don't know very much about her. We know a few places in the Talmud where she's quoted or referenced. We're going to study those together. We know a little bit about her family, that she was a daughter of a famous rabbi and a wife of a famous rabbi. And as I said, I think that that's very important, and that's almost always been the case for women until modern times and before, like modern educational models of schools and houses of Torah study that were open to women. Before all of that was created in modern times, if you were going to learn Talmud at all, Torah at all as a woman, it was at home because there was nowhere else to do it. So it meant you had to be super smart and you had to be really driven, but it also mean you have to have the support of really smart and open-minded, to a certain extent, fathers and husbands, really, in order to enable you to have the atmosphere, have the books, have the knowledge, have the background knowledge to actually start that learning. So that's certainly true of Beruriah. She comes from a very learned home, and she marries into a very learned home. And it seems like that these men, her father and her husband, must have been very influential in her ability to gain the education she did, in addition to, of course, her own brilliance and self-startedness, which clearly she had as well. Now it's time to learn some Talmud, okay? So we're going to do some texts about Beruriah. I think I'll do one or two of them, and then we will pause for questions, and then I'll do a few more, and then we'll talk about what this all really means for Judaism. Okay, so I have kind of summarized some of these texts, obviously giving them to you only in English translation. This first one is an interesting thing because it reflects on the relationship of Rabbi Meir and his wife Beruriah, or Beruriah and her husband Rabbi Meir. And it also begins to show us a little bit of Beruriah's personality. As I said, she must have been very much of a self-starter and very intelligent to get the kind of education she did in a place where it was not available to her from an institutional level. And some of her, I think her lack of shyness, shall we say, comes through in this particular story. So it starts off at home. There were some hooligans, I love that English translation, in Rabbi Meir's neighborhood who caused him to a great deal of anguish. It's a rabbi, he wanted to study, he wanted some peace and quiet. And so very drastically, he prayed to God to have mercy on them, which really meant he prayed for them to die. That is really drastic. Rabbi Meir's wife, Beruriah, said to him, what is your thinking? Like, what do you mean you're praying for them to die? And then like a good rabbi, although she's not a rabbi, she quotes from the Tanakh for him to prove her point, and then she does an interpretation of it. Is it because she says to him that it says in the book of Psalms, let sins cease from the land? Like you want our neighborhood to be free from sins? Like maybe that's the case, but she says to him, isn't it written, let sinners cease? It doesn't say that sinners should go away or die like you're wishing for, but rather let sins cease. So she's saying to him in kind of a direct but indirect way by quoting Torah in a very um, detailed way, by paying attention to the wording precisely, that she's saying to him, we shouldn't be asking people for people to die. That's extreme. Instead, if you want to pray at all, pray for them to turn around and do good, to return, to do tshuva, and not for them to die. So, she could have just said to him, you're crazy. You're an extremist. What's going on here? Don't ask for people to die. And instead, she was not shy about sharing her opinions, but she kind of couched it in Tanakh and her interpretation of Torah. This probably would not have been a very classic way for women to speak in these days, let alone women of famous rabbis, wives of famous rabbis. All right, now this text is probably the most explicit that demonstrates, in fact, how smart she was. It starts off with a story about two other rabbis. You'll see how she comes into it. So Rabbi Simlai, who I guess is the junior rabbi in this case, comes before Rabbi Yochanan, who's smarter and more well-known, and says to him, would the master, this is being very polite and asking him, teach me the book of genealogies. Okay, the book of genealogies, if you haven't heard of it, don't worry. No one has, because we don't have it anymore. I wrote here in the italics, the book of genealogies was a collection of Tannaitic rabbinic teachings that formed a midrash on the book of Chronicles. Okay, it is actually interesting when we're talking about traditions, oral traditions, written traditions. This was actually a book of written traditions that actually has been lost to Jewish history today. We don't have it anymore. But it clearly existed in the time of the Talmud. And this one junior rabbi wanted the senior rabbi to teach it to him. So initially, Rabbi Yochanan, the senior rabbi, didn't agree. He's like, no, I don't want to teach it to you. But eventually, Rabbi Simlai, the junior one, pressured Rabbi Yochanan until he agreed to teach it to him. So the junior rabbi then, Rabbi Simlai, said to him, teach me, okay, now that you've agreed to teach it to me, I'm giving you a time limit, teach it to me in 3 months. Rabbi Yochanan, at this point, the senior rabbi, threw a fit, basically, because apparently that was an inappropriate request, as we'll see here. He threw a clod of dirt at him. He took a clod of dirt and threw it at him. Again, kind of extremist behavior, and said, Brewery, okay, amazing here. Our woman is now going to be held up as an example par excellence of rabbinic learning. Brewery, wife of Rabbi Meir and daughter of Rabbi Hananiah ben Tradrot, in case you didn't know who we're talking about, was so sharp and had such a good memory that she learned 300 laws in one day from 300 different rabbis, sages. Okay, so it's talking about, like, boy, you think you're smart? You're nothing compared to her. Brewery was the smartest, and this is what she was able to do. And nonetheless, she did not fulfill her responsibility to properly learn the book of genealogies, that one that was being requested to be taught at this point, in 3 years. It took her 3 years. She couldn't even accomplish it in 3 years because it is so especially long and difficult. And you say I should teach it to you in only 3 months? After your inappropriate request, I'm not inclined to teach you at all. Okay? So, junior rabbi, senior rabbi, their relationship is one thing, but the idea is here to demonstrate to you that Breuriah is considered so smart that she even took her more than 3 years to accomplish this particular task. That's to show you how difficult the task is. But she was up for it, and she could do so much. So this is really this is the best example of the text we have so far that demonstrate how much she knew And really, I mean, I would argue how much she was respected in her knowledge as well, and being held up as an example, as role model in this case. Okay, we have some more examples, but I'm going to stop sharing for a minute to see your faces and ask if we have any questions. What do we say, ladies and gentlemen?
We do have a question,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm going to actually do a little preface if I can. I'm wondering, first of all, whether women were even reading at this point,
Uh-huh.
whether women were taught to read, because that was historically, I think, still kind of early for women to be taught to
Yes.
read. And
Yes.
my other thought is there probably were lots of women who were learning at home, but somehow their names weren't known. I mean, I can't imagine that there weren't fathers who were indulging their daughters who wanted to learn. Just my background thoughts.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Can I talk about that a little bit?
sure.
So yeah, I think that when we talk about literature, written and oral, um, really what you're touching on is a lot of that, and in terms of also what is considered important and who is considered important to learn. It's so many things that are involved in that. Um, the concept of oral literature is something that is so very foreign to us today. But in ancient times, it is well known that being able to recite orally and even understand text orally was part of the way people thought, the way people were taught. It certainly happened in non Jewish circles as well, in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, as well as in Jewish areas. So the idea of being able to read, as you're saying, in terms of being able to have access to this material, even reading alone takes on a whole different idea in a world of orality, right? Especially ancient times, pre-printing press, everything's handwritten, all of that. Once you had talk about the idea of orality and being able and literacy, then also you might as well throw in the idea of economic equality or not. It was expensive to own a scroll
Mm.
of anything written, um, or a codex, an early book. And also, most people, like in some places of the world today, had to spend every waking hour, every able-bodied person making enough like food to put on the table and having time to sit and learn to read, send your children off to learn to read rather than being farmhands, working with you. All of that is a luxury that was only affordable to people who literally could financially afford it. So you have a female literacy thing, you have an accessibility thing, you have non-universalized educational models, you have economic liabilities, all of that combined. It's quite amazing that anyone learned anything at all. So were we probably only talking about an elite of the elite? And even within that, I think you're probably right that we have other exceptions of women who were able to accomplish certain things educationally. But their voices have been lost to us from history because it is men who wrote down the history. So
Yeah,
it is perhaps only the education, this very, very special ones, perhaps also because they were connected. We see the family connections of this woman as well. Perhaps that was part of it that have been recorded for us in history that there's very often the creme de la creme that rose to the top, and we see these exceptions that we have
right.
recorded evidence of. Were there
Okay.
others? Yeah,
Yes.
probably, but I'd like to know about them.
Yeah. Okay. So we do
Okay,
have a couple of questions.
please.
Just like Talmud study, is putting on tefillin also forbidden or discouraged?
Ah, so Tefillin,
Yeah.
you said? Ask Rabbi Cutler.
Yeah.
Yeah, I told you. And this is my venturing into a topic of halacha, of Jewish law, because it is something I think certainly it's not considered controversial anymore, even in, certainly modern Orthodox circles, certainly conservative reform, etc., like the Torah belongs to all of us, and we should be able to study it. I mean, perhaps in modern Orthodox circles, which we'll get to by the end, it might be different because the learning might be sex segregated, men and women separately. But it is not considered, again, since the end of the 19th century, really controversial to discuss the idea of opening the world of Torah to women as well. Other rituals have a lot more complications involved, very legalistic, and so I will leave that to. I could teach it, but I have not been hired to teach that, and I will not unless I will leave that to Rabbi Keller.
But I will make a comment because I had asked this question many years ago, and I was told the story of Rashi's daughter who did wear tefillin, and that was a long time ago, and there was a lot of explanation behind it. But it as you say, it's been a very interesting conversation for a long time.
Yes.
Okay, then the next question, which I've now lost, is there a specific time frame in which Brewery lived?
Yes, so she's in the beginning of that time, that classical rabbinic time period that I said was from around the time 100 to 600. And she lived in the beginning of that time period. So in around the first century, I would say end of first, beginning of second century CE.
Okay. And I don't know if this question is for now or past, but could women become scribes?
So again, matter of practical halacha, there are female scribes today. Certainly would not be considered in kind of even central or Orthodox or right-wing Orthodox circles. We have at least one female scribe in Toronto that I know of that has not written a Sefer Torah, but she has written Megillat Esther. That's an artist that lives in Toronto named Leah Crust. Some of you might know her. And it's a complicated issue of different kinds of roles for the community. In traditional Judaism, a similar question might be, can women be a mohel? Can do a brit milah? Can women be a shochet or to kill kosher animals? So a lot of those things are actually permissible for women, but just sociologically, just have been within the purview of men. So sometimes it's more of a patriarchal tradition rather than actually halacha, but sometimes those things get a little mixed up together.
Okay, that's the end of the official
Okay,
question.
good. So just in interest of time, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the text. I'm going to paraphrase text though, because I want to reserve time. I'm going to paraphrase, but you'll see them in front of you. You can read them if you like. Here we go, share screen. All right, next one. Okay, this text is not really so, it's interesting in showing us her kind of audacity and not being worried about standing up for herself and correcting other people, even rabbis, when they do something wrong. In this particular case, she's telling a rabbi, rabbis usually say don't talk too much to women. You're asking me a question that takes too much time and you could have done it in a shorter way. And she's not embarrassed to say that to a rabbi. This one in particular talks also, it's a way of her interpreting Torah to explain that you should be confident and secure in your Torah. It's a way of her reprimanding a student who was whispering with some kind of modesty or false modesty or perhaps lack of confidence when he was learning Torah. And she's saying to him, speak up and be confident. And if you do it the other way and you're too quiet about it, then, it might you might forget it. Like it won't be instilled in you. And she uses Torah commentaries to further explain that. Excuse me. This one is a very legalistic concept concerning whether a particular type of movable door bolt or locking system for doors in ancient times could be manipulated on a certain way on Shabbat. And she ruled that it was permissible, and then the rabbis around her accepted her ruling and said, yes, she made the right decision. Very unusual for a woman. All right, so I wish I actually could share more stories with you about her. There actually aren't really very many stories, except for the story that tells that most people think is the story of her end. And this one is important for us to see. This is the one that unfortunately became the most, from my perspective, unfortunately became the most influentially known story about Beruriah. And this is the one that's going to take us to an emotional low. I'm warning you, trigger warning. But since it's the one that's become the most well known, I think it's really important to share. It starts off in a really strange way, where she sent her husband, Rabbi Meir, to Rome to redeem her sister, who was being held captive and forced into a life of prostitution by the Roman authorities. This is after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The Romans were in charge of the land of Israel and the whole surrounding area, and could, do, things with their Jewish subjects, whatever they pleased. And apparently, this Beruriah's sister was being misused in this way. Rabbi Meir agreed to go and save his sister-in-law, assuming she would pass a test, though. He wasn't even going to save her for just because she was his sister-in-law. He would set a test for her to determine if she was actually living a life of sin, in which case I guess he would decide that she's not necessarily appropriate to redeem. But anyway, she passed the test. He was satisfied with the results. He saved her, but in doing so, made himself an outlaw among the Roman authorities because they had her held captive. So once, when he was running away, Rabbi Meir, from the Roman authorities who were trying to capture him, he did something inappropriate and embarrassing, okay, as part of his trying to escape. We don't know exactly what that was. In the Talmud, it gives a number of different examples of what that could have been. Not a surprise, some of them might be kind of sexually inappropriate things, like he accidentally ran into a house of prostitution or something. It's a weird kind of ending-ish to the story. But then it says, as a result of these kind of inappropriate, embarrassing situation he found himself in inadvertently, he became so embarrassed that he fled to Babylonia, where there was a Jewish community, but his home had been in the land of Israel, and he figured the rumors would follow him back from Rome that he had done something inappropriate, and he couldn't stay in his hometown anymore, and he left and he went to start a fresh life over in Babylonia, where, as I said, there was a Jewish community. Okay, that could be the whole story. It's a fairly strange story for a very famous rabbi. Remember, this is the same rabbi who's the husband of Beruriah, excuse me. But the story then, at the end of the story, there's kind of a one-line addition where it says, some say he fled because of the Brewery Incident. So the idea is here, he fled from his homeland of Babylonia because he was embarrassed that he did something weird when he was being chased by the Romans. Could be. Or that he fled because of the Brewery Incident. No further explanation. That is the end of the story. And you think, what the heck could the Brewery Incident be that would be, so horrific that he, hung his head in shame and had to literally leave town, this famous rabbi? Well, the Talmud doesn't tell us. However, someone very famous does tell us, namely Rashi. Okay, so Rashi, I'm sure you have all heard of. Actually, I'm going to go back to that in a minute. This is just a drawing meant to simulate him, the most well-known rabbinic commentator really of all times, right? Most people, if they're studying Torah, if they're studying Talmud, they never study it standalone. They always study it alongside the commentary of Rashi. As a matter of fact, his commentary is printed on the page of all of these volumes. Now, the thing is about Rashi that most people, I think, forget sometimes is that he didn't live at the time of the Tanakh. He did not live at the time of the Talmud. He lived hundreds and hundreds of years later in the 11th century in France. So, how is it that his commentaries could be so reliable and so used and so helpful to understand this ancient material? Well, obviously, he was brilliant. Okay, that's obviously going to put that into one category. He was brilliant. And then he is able to base all of his commentaries on prior rabbinic literature, everything that was written before that. He had studied, he had probably memorized, he was able to apply all of that knowledge. He probably had oral traditions too. It's interesting we're talking about literacy, but there was probably were still oral traditions being passed down in the 11th century. He sometimes used logic. He sometimes used linguistics, his knowledge of grammar and languages, and he might have had other sources as well that perhaps are lost to us today. Okay, I wanted to remind you that about this commentary because his commentary on the Brewery Incident becomes the main understanding of what the Brewery Incident was. The Brewery Incident, according to Rashi, was that one time Beruriah mocked the sages over their saying, which says at least twice in the Talmud, women are lightheaded. That's not considered a compliment. It usually means that they're not serious, and often means that they're not serious, sometimes even in terms of sexual matters. Rabbi Meir, who we saw already, tested his sister-in-law, apparently decided to test his wife as well, which is shocking. Rabbi Meir said to Beruriah, by your life, like I swear, you will ultimately affirm their words. You're ultimately going to agree with the rabbis that women are lightheaded. And then he sets out, unbeknownst to her, to test her. He instructed one of his disciples, one of his students, to seduce her, sexually seduce her, as a test to see if she was really lightheaded. The student apparently urged her for many days until she finally consented, and she committed adultery by being with him. When the matter became known to her that her own husband had tested her in this horrible way, she committed suicide. And with that, Rabbi Meir fled out of disgrace, fled his hometown, recognized that what he had done set this horrible, horrible thing into action. Now, if you ask any Talmud scholar, what is the Brewery Incident, they will tell you this. The Beruriah was tested by her husband, she failed, and consequently committed suicide. The most brilliant rabbinic female minds of the Talmud, in the end, failed in this way. Now, for years, this was used to discourage women from learning Talmud. You think you could learn Talmud? You think you're smart as Beruriah? Look what happened to her. And this is the down point, right? So how am I going to save us from this down point and say, oh my gosh, women should study Talmud, which I fully agree they should. Well, I'm going to show you two things. One is I'm going to remind you is that Rashi is the one that said that. Now, saintly Rashi, I don't want to take away from the greatest commentator of our times. But he wrote this commentary hundreds of years after it happened, and there is no other source. And believe me, historians and scholars have been looking for a long time. No other source other than Rashi's commentary that says this is what happened to Beruriah. Did he make it up? Did he base it on something that he had that no one else had? We don't know. We really don't know. It leaves us with a big question mark. But all I'm saying is that this horrible end to Beruriah didn't necessarily exist in the time of the Talmud and in the time when she lived. But somehow this ending was placed on her story hundreds of years later. So, as I said, in the modern age, it has become apparent that women need to study Torah, women need to study Talmud, and take a center seat at the table of Jewish learning and Jewish life as well, regardless of what Rashi said happened to Beruriah. We can look at Beruriah for the role model that she was in terms of her brilliance and her learning. And we can say that perhaps she made a mistake at her end of her life, or perhaps this didn't happen at all, and it's somehow Rashi tacked this on to the end of her story. But I wanted to share with you a video now to show you what is happening with women learning Talmud today. It happens for the most part in Jerusalem, well, all over Israel and in New York City. And I want to show you basically a promotional video that talks a little bit about Beruriah and women's learning of Talmud in Israel today. And hopefully it'll cheer us up a little bit to see how women are dedicating themselves to Talmud for their love of Talmud, for their relationship with God, but also for their need to be part of the central enterprise of traditional Judaism, namely Talmud study. Okay. Bear with me. I'm going to bring the volume down low because it's in Hebrew. It's very fast, so I'm slowing it down so you'll be able to read the subtitles, so the sound might sound a little bit funny. The video goes back and forth between contemporary modern times, and there's like a historical reenactment of Brewery when she was a young woman. Okay, so you'll see there's a historical reenactment blended together with women studying Talmud today. Here we go. Wait, I'm just sorry. I'm just going to slow it down so that you can see it better, and then I'll start it from the beginning. Here we have the historical reenactment of Brewery. You have to read the subtitles.
גם בתקופת המשנה יש את ברוריה ועוד נשים שלמדו. ברוריה הייתה בתו של רבי חנניה בן תרדיון. אבי זיכרונו לברכה שהיה ניצול שואה ותלמיד חכם. ראה את הסקרנות שלי והחליט שכדאי להתחיל לנסות ללמוד גמרא. עזבתי את הכל והלכתי ללמוד תורה כמו שחלמתי. להיות כמו מודל שאבא שלי הציב לי. חכמים מספרים שהיא הייתה ידענית מופלאה שידעה המון הלכות. הייתה לה תעוזה ללכת בעקבות מה שהיא אוהבת, בעקבות מה שהיא מאמינה בו. לימדה את הגברים שהיו מסביבה.
הסבתא שלי, האבא שלה היה דיין, ממנה למדתי, וראיתי את זה כטבעי מאוד, שאישה מלמדת תורה, ההלכה נפסקה לפי ברוריה. אנחנו נכנסות ממש באמצע הסוגיה שהתחילה בימי ברוריה וברבי מאיר, ואני מרגישה שפתחנו דלתות בית המדרש לנשים, ואנחנו יושבות גם בחברת חכמי המסורה. היום אפשר להוסיף גם נשים חשובות אחרות ששותפות לשיח התורני הכל כך משמעותי הזה. אני לא יכולה לדמיין בשום דרך את החיים שלי ללא הלימוד הזה שהוא אפשרויות אינסופיות כמעט של חשיבה.
שיבה. מדובר בנס גדול שקרה לנשים בדור שלנו. הדף היומי הוא איזשהו ביטוי להרגשה של נשים שהתלמוד שייך גם להן.
לפתוח את עולם של התורה לנשים, שנשים יוכלו ללמוד את כל התורה כולה.
יש נשים שלומדות לבד, מקשיבות לפודקאסט, לומדות בכל מיני מקומות, בכל מיני מסגרות. זה הפך להיות משהו שהוא מאוד טבעי, מאוד נגיש.
Okay, I think we'll stop it there for now. Just wanted to give you a feel. The idea of, this medieval commentator that said, again, he's Rashi, it's a big deal, right? But nevertheless, a medieval commentator wrote this one idea about Beruriah, even though she was so amazing, that she eventually succumbed to her weak female nature and she was a failure in the end of her life, is something that unfortunately was told since that time to many, many Jewish women in terms of who might have tried to study Torah. And thank God, since the modern period, for lots of reasons, including potential assimilation and everything else, that the doors of Talmud and Torah learning have started to be opened slowly, and there's really a huge renaissance of it happening in Israel. Huge, relatively huge, and to a certain extent on small, in other Jewish communities around the world, and of course in New York City as well. So I felt like, even though we were talking about an ancient woman, that was important to talk about her positive legacy, how her legacy was potentially manipulated for the negative, but then in the end too, that hopefully I've been able to show you that women have risen up and to redeem themselves in Beruriah's name and in others, to become of that very important, for spiritual and political and national, all kinds of reasons, way to study Torah and study Talmud. And we studied some Talmud here together today too, which was a huge treat for me to be able to do that with you. Okay, that's it. Questions?
Oh, okay. Anna, let me see. One question is there a program in Toronto where women can study Torah?
Can I
the
just
same
jump in
way
there?
to study
Yeah.
Talmud in the same way?
Yes.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, sure. Randy, give us some addresses. Give us some names.
Well, my sister, not me, was involved in starting the Korot in Toronto a number of years ago. And it is still running. I don't know how active it is. It is a worldwide organization. It was very controversial at the time, which is not that long ago, maybe 10 years ago. Very controversial because she was part of the Orthodox community. But I believe it's still ongoing.
What exists in Toronto is kind of what you said in terms of Mikorot or Torah in Motion or different shuls. I mean, there's, adult education that either is in some places for women only or other places that allow men and women to study together, through shuls and organizations, individual classes. But there is no or through the universities also, like through the Hillels have it also for on campus. But there is no full-time women's Talmud learning in Toronto. There exists, again, in Israel, primarily in Jerusalem, in New York City at the GPAS Institute at Yeshiva University, and at Drisha Institute. And of course, there are organizations that allow for co-ed studying that invite women along, and conservative women and otherwise, but no, not in Toronto. So, but like I said, through adult education or through other organizations, like you said, Mikorot, Torah in Motion, whatever, they occasionally have kind of intro to Talmud classes.
Can you write those names down in the chat that you were mentioning?
The only two, the adult education ones.
Right.
That
Randy was saying. Is there a name?
So that is Mikorot, which is actually they only have one or two classes a year. Okay. And the other one is, and
there
actually,
it is.
Randy, it's way older than that. I hate to tell you, because it existed when I moved back to Toronto, which is 20 years ago already. Okay. And the other one is Torah in Motion. You can look them up online. They're not bricks and mortars institutions. They're, right. They have offices and they just exist. Well, now they exist online, but, and otherwise they, would rent rooms from shuls and have programs there, or different adult education venues in different shuls.
We should start one.
Yeah.
Well, so we're talking potentially about what comes next.
Yeah.
So.
I don't want anyone to leave yet. There's a couple of other questions which
okay.
I'll ask you, Anna, but I don't want anyone to leave till we thank you. So one question was Rabbi Meir ever held account for what he caused to happen?
Yeah, so look, I'm not in love with his whole personality the way it is in the text of the Talmud alone, when he, rather than just saving his sister-in-law from a life of prostitution, that he actually tests her first before he agrees to save her. So this concept of testing, women that he doesn't trust in terms of issues having to do with sexuality. I mean, certainly that theme appears in the Talmud itself. Already he starts looking, to me at least, like not such a fabulous character. And then that theme kind of writ large happens in the later, Brewery Incident as described by Rashi. And look, as far as we know, it says he himself took himself into self-exile. I mean, not off into the desert where he'd be suffering. He went to another Jewish community. So I don't know if that's if he exiled himself as punishment or because he was embarrassed and, he wanted a fresh start. So, but no other consequences are recorded.
Another question.
In for a second. How do you send a question?
In the chat.
I don't see any. I don't see any. I wrote it in my little corner, but I don't see any way to send it.
Wherever you wrote it, there you do return, like this, like on your keyboard.
Yeah.
Or you can just ask it now.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jeanette, just ask the question.
Jeanette,
it's easier now.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, because I don't.
Okay.
I don't know how to send it. I want to know if the student was punished in some way. I mean, he committed a sin too.
I know. Isn't that so? You could have a whole course on the ethics and the lack of ethics of that whole relationship. Like the idea of aren't we supposed to stand up? I mean, you're supposed to have respect for parents and rabbis, and leaders, but if they do wrong, we're supposed to be able to correct them. So it's a really interesting concept regarding that if we're talking about the centrality of Torah study, it's not a surprise then that the centrality of the Torah scholar-student relationship becomes so important and almost on the same level, if not higher, in those circles between parents and children, that respect that's even insisted upon in the Ten Commandments for children to respect their parents. So but the Talmud even discusses that relationship as well as the rabbi as well, that in terms of if that your rabbi or your parent is doing something horrible, that you do have a responsibility to do the right thing and to make sure that horrible thing doesn't continue. So yes, I would say that the horribleness of the story is on so many levels, including that. Yes.
And one last question. Why would Rashi cast aspersions on Beruriah? His own daughters were supposed to be Talmud scholars. So why would he be negative about this?
So again, assuming that Rashi came up with it on his own, right? We don't have a text that has been preserved for us that gives us this information. Maybe the text did exist and he didn't come up with it and he just passed it along. If he came up with it on his own, it does seem somewhat not to be matching with some of his other thoughts about women. And so, again, there's some big question marks there. I guess also we have to think about, even though his daughters are considered to be more learned than others, again, they grew up in a very special household. Sometimes there are people that have bad ideas about, a larger group like women, but think that their own daughters are exceptions to the rule, maybe. I'm trying to psychoanalyze Rashi, which is, pretty much impossible. He's not here lying on a couch in front of me, ready to be psychoanalyzed. But it does, there are so many question marks in the story, so much so that I would really love to say it's a blip, it's an anomaly, let's leave it to the side. Unfortunately, I can't, because Jewish history has not ignored the story. As much as we try to explain it or explain it away or understand it, it's not, it has unfortunately taken center stage in many rabbis' arguments as to why women shouldn't be involved in these endeavors. So that's why we have to discuss it, really.
Anna,
Yes.
you have taken us on a roller coaster journey through the Torah and history itself. You have taught us about strong women who stood up to their husbands, male leaders, and the rulers of the land. They pushed the limits discreetly and sometimes not so discreetly. These women were smart, strong, driven, and energetic. To quote Maya Angelou, each time a woman stands up for herself, she stands up for all women. Adath Israel in the last couple of years has made some significant changes, particularly around women's issues. The changes have been supported and encouraged and, quite frankly, pushed by the women of Adath. How appropriate that one of our first programs is this. We thank Rabbi Cutler for making the shidduch. It has been wonderful. And how appropriate our first program, the 2 series, is about learning about extraordinary women. And our teacher, Dr. Anna Urowitz Freudenstein, is an extraordinary woman. And I thank you so much. There's all kinds, if you can read the chat after, people have loved it, enjoyed it, and we're not saying goodbye. We'll give you a break and maybe hear from some other people in terms of what they might like to learn next, and maybe get some ideas from you. And I think we will definitely be revisiting this, because it has been a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You know what they say in Hebrew, Lehitraot, right?
Mm-hmm.
That means see you later,
Right.
rather than goodbye.
Yes.
So it's been great for me. It's been, a lot of ideas that have just been bouncing around in my head for a long time, that I was given this wonderful opportunity to bring them all together, hopefully in an organized way. And so that was very useful and helpful for me, but also a thrill for me to be excited about these ideas and to be able to share that excitement with other people. And through the screen, I think I've been able to feel a little bit of that excitement back, and I'm back at me, and I'm so happy to be able to share.
Thank you. And now I just have a couple of tiny little things. Just a reminder, next week we have Marcia Fenwick, who's doing, as Randy, I think, or Gidi said at the beginning, you can have your cake and eat it too. Thursday, May 13th at 1 p.m. we have a series of programs coming up with our caterers who are going to do some cooking demonstrations for us. Those are just about totally set, so watch the information. And this is very important for everybody there. We have a planning meeting next Tuesday, May 11th at 11 o'clock to talk about programming going forward. We're looking for people with ideas. We will send out an email to the emails that we have. If you want to be included in it, please send a message to Anna, or to, not this Anna, but she doesn't want them, but to Anna at Shul or Randy or me. Just get in touch with us. And please, the more people, the better. We'll do it on Zoom. And we have a lot of fun schmoozing a little bit. And we're going to plan some great, great programs. And we can talk about more programs with this, Anna. So I thank you all again. Thank you all for coming. It really has been a great experience. I know I can speak personally and from what I've heard from everybody else. So lehitraot.
Lehitraot. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.